Welcome to the debate. Today we're diving into a really fascinating work, Heaven Invades Earth, a book that powerfully describes the author's vision of the supernatural. Now, this material, it often discusses both, well, direct encounters with demonic forces and also the profound importance of personal spiritual discipline. And this raises a pretty pivotal question for us. What is the primary and most effective approach for believers to engage with and overcome negative spiritual influences as described within the book? My perspective is that the material primarily champions active, direct spiritual warfare and deliverance ministry, confronting demonic forces head-on through the authority given by Jesus Christ.
And I'll contend that the book suggests the most effective and really foundational approach is more about internal transformation, rigorous discernment, and maintaining spiritual purity by aligning with God's presence. And this, thereby, largely prevents rather than primarily battles these demonic incursions.
Okay, so the book Heaven Invades Earth, it offers some, I think, really compelling evidence for the necessity of direct confrontation and deliverance ministry as a primary means of overcoming negative spiritual influences. Chapter 6, aptly titled Spiritual Warfare and Deliverance, is incredibly explicit on this. It details various encounters where individuals manifest what the author clearly identifies as demonic influence, and the prescribed response, well, it involves commanding the demon to leave. Now, this isn't passive. It's performed using the power of the blood of Jesus and, significantly, the authority given to us by Jesus Christ. The author repeatedly stresses the importance of being prepared and equipped for this direct engagement. He even mentions the practical aspect of teamwork being needed sometimes to physically restrain individuals during, powerful manifestations. And consider that memorable experience recounted in Chapter 8 with the guest speaker, David Herzog. A woman from Haiti manifested demonic spirits right during a service, and the resolution, again, it highlights the potency of direct deliverance. Furthermore, Chapter 9, The Reality of Witchcraft and the Super, reinforces this proactive stance by sharing the author's own personal, pretty terrifying encounter with a girl practicing witchcraft. This isn't just about avoiding an opening, it's about addressing a tangible, dangerous reality that demands active supernatural solutions from the church. To me, the material clearly advocates for an offensive posture in the spiritual realm, actively engaging and defeating these forces.
Right. I understand why you emphasize that direct engagement, and certainly the book contains those powerful accounts, no doubt. However, I read the material as strongly suggesting that the primary and, crucially, the most effective approach to dealing with negative spiritual influences actually stems from internal spiritual purity, rigorous discernment, and a consistent alignment with God's presence. This approach, you see, in essence, either prevents demonic incursions from occurring in the first place, or it largely neutralizes their impact if they do try. Chapter 1, Heaven Invading Earth, it sets a kind of foundational tone, instructing believers to come out from among them and be separate. It cautions specifically against being led astray by worldly influences, because, as the text states, our flesh is weak. Now, this isn't really about preparing for battle so much as preventing the need for one.
Okay.
And Chapter 3, The Dangers of Mixing the Spiritual and, is quite critical here. It details how certain holistic healers and faith healers might not be truly aligned with God. It explicitly warns that practices like yoga, certain martial arts, horoscopes, fortune tellers, these things can open individuals up to demonic influences. The text then urges the church to stand against such deceptions through discernment. This indicates this internal vigilance, this careful sifting of influences is paramount. Chapter 7, The Power of Sound and Influence, further supports this by highlighting the negative impact of, say, secular music and the importance of modesty and pure relationships to maintain our spiritual purity. And ultimately, chapters 11 and 15, discussing tuning into God's frequency, which refers to achieving this profound spiritual attunement, almost like calibrating one's spirit to divine signals and spirit-to-spirit understanding. Well, they illustrate that soaking in God's presence and achieving oneness with the Spirit the Son and the Father, create an open heaven. Now, this isn't just a metaphor. It's described as a spiritual state where divine acceleration and God's glory naturally dominate. And in such an atmosphere, many direct confrontations are rendered unnecessary because you're actively avoiding what the book calls the foul odor, a spiritual metaphor for the negative resonance created by impure attitudes that might attract or sustain demonic activity. So, building on my point about prevention, let's maybe dive into a core area of disagreement: the origin of negative spiritual influence. The material, as I see it, strongly links these influences to choices believers make. For instance, you have chapter 3's warnings against mixing the spiritual, where, spiritual practices not originating from God can unintentionally invite darkness, or chapter 1's admonition against allowing secular philosophies and New Age beliefs to dominate. This perspective suggests a causative link. Human actions and choices create openings. The text frequently implies that if believers maintain spiritual purity and exercise discernment, well, many of these negative influences just wouldn't gain a foothold to begin with. The warning in chapter 3 against practices like yoga and certain martial arts, opening individuals to demonic influences, that provides a pretty clear example of this door-open mechanism, highlighting how our engagement with the world directly impacts our spiritual vulnerability. It seems the author posits that prevention through purity and vigilance is paramount because these influences often gain entry through specific breaches.
Okay, I see why you emphasize those choices and those doors. The material certainly highlights the consequences of misaligned spiritual practices. Definitely. But I'm not convinced that these doors opened are the primary or even the sole origin, nor that preventing them negates the need for direct confrontation. Even if doors are open through individual choices, the text demonstrates what seems like an inherent spiritual battlefield that requires active engagement regardless. Chapter 6 directly states, with no qualification about prior human error, spiritual warfare is a reality that we must acknowledge and confront. This isn't just about avoiding open doors. It sounds like a fundamental, ever-present spiritual reality. The author's personal encounter with the girl practicing witchcraft in Chapter 9, for example, portrays a manifestation of evil that, it needed confrontation, a direct intervention, to address its consequences, not merely prevention. The emphasis isn't just on what causes the influence, but on the constant active battle that believers are called to engage in. This implies to me a reality of spiritual opposition that exists independently of, or at least beyond, just passively avoiding openings. It suggests an ongoing war, not just, a series of skirmishes triggered by human invitation that demands proactive participation.
But doesn't the sheer volume of material dedicated to discernment and purity suggest that the author sees these internal states as the primary defense against an already existing spiritual landscape? I mean, if the battlefield is ever present, as you suggest, then isn't the most effective strategy to fortify oneself from within so that the enemy cannot gain ground? The language of separate in Chapter 1 or stand against such deceptions in Chapter 3, it doesn't feel like it's merely about avoiding some influences, but about preventing widespread incursions. It implies that a fortified internal state acts as a powerful deterrent, reducing the need for constant external battle.
That's a fair point about internal fortification. It is. But the book consistently pairs that internal strength with an external call to action. The very examples of direct confrontation in chapters 6, 8, and 9, they often involve individuals who are already under influence, not merely at risk of it. These aren't scenarios where purity alone was sufficient. The author frequently portrays spiritual influences as aggressive entities that will invade, irrespective sometimes of a believer's initial purity, sometimes just targeting those who are vulnerable. The concept of an ever-present battle isn't merely defensive in the book, it's also offensive, calling for believers to actively push back the darkness in their communities, even when individuals haven't explicitly opened a door. It suggests that the spiritual realm isn't just sitting there waiting for an invitation, it's actively seeking inroads that must be met with equally active resistance.
And this leads us compellingly, I think, to the mechanism of overcoming these forces. The material consistently stresses that overcoming is through the direct exercise of authority given to us by Jesus Christ. Chapter 6 is, it's unambiguous. In every encounter with demonic forces, our faith and the authority given to us by Jesus Christ are our greatest weapons. We must stand firm in our belief that God has all power over the demonic. It's not about our strength, but His. This is about wielding spiritual power actively, a direct engagement using spiritual authority, often through verbal commands and declarations. It's a very assertive, authoritative mechanism, not merely a receptive one where one sort of passively waits for change. It's about taking dominion and enforcing the victory of Christ, not just trying to avoid the enemy.
These are active verbs requiring the believer to step into that delegated authority.
Yeah, that's a compelling argument for the role of authority. And I agree, the book certainly highlights its importance, no question. However, I'd frame the primary mechanism differently. The book frequently speaks of cultivating an atmosphere of God's glory through worship and His presence, which then sort of naturally drives out negative forces. Chapter 2 suggests that instead of just relying on welcome packets and practical strategies for church growth, the focus should be on creating an atmosphere where God's presence is palpable. The implication there seems to be that when people encounter God's glory, they experience healing and deliverance as a natural byproduct, not necessarily always through direct confrontational commands. Chapter 11, for example, describes soaking in God's presence, that term referring to prolonged, intentional immersion in prayer and worship to receive profound healing, deliverance, and spiritual breakthroughs. This implies that internal receptivity to God's presence, cultivating that divine atmosphere, naturally leads to release from bondage. It's less about actively commanding, maybe, and more about creating an environment where evil simply cannot thrive, or perhaps chooses to flee, much like, light dispels darkness without having to command it to leave.
While cultivating an atmosphere of God's presence is undoubtedly powerful, I agree, and it can certainly make evil uncomfortable, does the book suggest this alone is the mechanism for overcoming or expelling an entrenched demonic presence? My reading is that the atmosphere often facilitates the exercise of authority, rather than replacing it entirely. It prepares the ground, perhaps, for direct action. The examples of deliverance almost always culminate in a direct command. The power of the blood of Jesus and the authority given by Jesus Christ, these aren't really atmospheric concepts. They are instruments to be actively wielded. An atmosphere might make a demon uneasy, sure, but the explicit instructions and testimonies seem to point to a definitive, authoritative eviction. If soaking in God's presence was primarily sufficient, why the consistent emphasis on learning to command the demon to leave? It seems to me the atmosphere creates the context, but the authority provides the direct mechanism for actually overcoming.
Well, maybe it's about discerning the level of engagement needed. If the atmosphere of God's glory is cultivated consistently, the doors we talked about are less likely to open, and any existing influences are severely weakened. Perhaps the book implies that while direct authority is available for acute manifestations, a sustained atmosphere of God's presence is a more foundational and preventative mechanism overall, reducing the frequency and severity of those acute situations that then require direct confrontation. It's about maintaining a spiritual climate that is inherently inhospitable to darkness, making direct confrontation a necessary but perhaps secondary response to spiritual breaches, rather than the primary mode of operation for all spiritual opposition. The distinction isn't strictly either or, perhaps, but a question of which approach is presented as the primary ongoing strategy. And this brings us neatly to the scope of spiritual engagement. Is it predominantly internal transformation or external confrontation? I'd argue the material leans heavily, really heavily, into internal transformation. It extensively focuses on aligning oneself with God's frequency in chapter 11, which, as we discussed, is about that deep spiritual attunement. It speaks to ensuring the intent of the heart is pure in chapter 17, and allowing God's presence to literally change our very reality in chapter 1. The profound idea here seems to be that a transformed internal state is not merely a defense, but actually the most effective offense against negative spiritual influences. Chapter 15 on spirit-to-spirit understanding discusses how our attitudes, words, and actions are breathed in by the Lord, highlighting the internal spiritual fragrance we emit, a kind of spiritual resonance that either invites God's presence or conversely repels it. This strong emphasis on internal purity and alignment suggests that the most potent battles are often won within, by cultivating a spiritual environment where darkness simply cannot find resonance.
Despite the acknowledged importance of internal states, and it is important, no doubt, the material is truly replete with examples and explicit calls for external, active engagement with the demonic. It doesn't seem to be enough to just be internally pure. The book demonstrates that one must also actively confront the external manifestations of darkness that impact others and the world around us. Chapter 9, for instance, talks about ministering to people in the streets who have experienced demonic activity. Now, this isn't just about their personal alignment or internal state. It's about the church needing to step up and provide supernatural solutions for problems manifesting outwardly in the lives of others. This is an external, outward-facing ministry. It goes beyond internal alignment, directly addressing existing manifestations of evil that are affecting the broader community.
The repeated emphasis on deliverance ministry conducted in teams in Chapter 6 further underscores this external, practical, and very direct approach to engagement. It suggests to me that while internal transformation prepares the believer, the primary work of overcoming in many presented cases is an outward confrontation.
But doesn't the book often present those external confrontations as responses to existing problems rather than the primary strategy for ongoing spiritual growth and health? A person ministering on the street, as you mentioned from Chapter 9, often engages with someone who is already afflicted. The material, however, also heavily emphasizes proactive measures. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, if the author sees this internal preventative work as the larger, ongoing, and arguably more effective strategy to minimize the need for constant external battle. Is it like building a strong immune system so you don't get sick in the first place, or just focusing on treating symptoms once they appear? The focus on God's frequency or spiritual purity seems very much about building that robust spiritual immune system from within.
I appreciate that analogy, I do. But the book portrays the spiritual battlefield as so aggressive, so invasive sometimes, that merely building an immune system, however strong, seems insufficient on its own. The constant examples of direct confrontation, where believers initiate the engagement by discerning and then addressing demonic influence in others, that points to a proactive stance that goes beyond just personal immunity. It's not just about treating symptoms, it's about actively clearing territory for the kingdom. The author often depicts spiritual forces as actively seeking to oppress and deceive, sometimes regardless of a person's current internal state. This implies that even a believer who is deeply transformed internally is still called to an external authoritative engagement to actively bring heaven to earth, which in the book's context often means displacing existing darkness through direct supernatural action.
Internal transformation, while vital, serves maybe as the foundation for the authority needed to engage externally, not necessarily as a replacement for that engagement itself. So, to wrap up my view, the material in Heaven Invades Earth, it leaves very little doubt about the reality of an active spiritual battlefield and presents a clear, quite emphatic call for believers to engage directly in spiritual warfare. Through powerful testimonies, explicit instructions, and these vivid examples of liberation, it really champions the exercise of Christ's authority and the power of his blood to confront and defeat demonic forces. This direct, authoritative approach is consistently presented as a necessary, effective, and often, I believe, the primary strategy for fulfilling the book's vision of bringing heaven down to earth. It's fundamentally an offensive posture, moving beyond mere defense.
And while I certainly acknowledge the reality of spiritual opposition described, and the occasional, sometimes critical necessity of direct confrontation, my reading suggests that the most potent and foundational approach as presented throughout the book lies in cultivating personal spiritual purity, developing that acute discernment to avoid compromise, and consistently immersing oneself in God's presence through worship and deep connection. These internal disciplines, I believe the author argues, create an environment where negative spiritual influences are naturally repelled or overcome, making direct confrontation a necessary but perhaps secondary response to specific spiritual breaches, rather than the primary day-to-day mode of operation.
It's more about maintaining a spiritual climate that inherently prevents disease rather than solely focusing on the treatments after the fact.
Yeah, it's clear the book Heaven Invades Earth certainly presents a multifaceted view of spiritual engagement. Our discussion today has really highlighted that the material provides robust arguments and vivid examples for both direct, authoritative confrontation of negative spiritual influences and the profound, transformative importance of internal spiritual purity, discernment, and immersion in God's presence.
Right. And what's truly insightful, I think, is considering how these two powerful approaches might actually interrelate. Perhaps the book implies a kind of hierarchy where that foundational internal strength empowers and clarifies the application of external authority, or perhaps it's more of a dynamic interplay where both are always at work, with one maybe taking precedence depending on the specific situation. Understanding this intricate interplay is really crucial for grasping the author's complete vision, and we'd certainly encourage all our listeners to explore this rich source material further to form their own conclusions on the most effective path forward.